Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, old Blue Eyes himself. What a marvelous facade of charm and velvet-toned sentiment, a golden veneer laid thick over something far more sinister. If his music was meant to embody sophistication and romance, one is tempted to ask, at what cost? To listen to Sinatra, to truly revel in his dulcet croonings, is to ignore the blood-soaked shadows that trail him. A grotesque dance, macabre, of mobster grins, broken kneecaps, and the very real screams of his contemporaries' victims. It is to be serenaded not by a troubadour of love, but by a gilded shill for organized violence. For Sinatra, association with the mafia was not incidental, not a quaint artifact of his Italian-American upbringing or the product of mere circumstance. It was essential, integral, a mutually beneficial arrangement. If Sinatra's career was the soaring jet, the mob was its propellant. He was no mere hanger-on, but a sycophant, a willing courtier to those for whom brutality and coercion were the lingua franca. From his cozy friendships with Lucky Luciano and Sam Giancana to his willingness to act as a courier, a middleman, a favor dispenser, Sinatra was not just aware of mob violence. He was complicit in the broader cultural machinery that enabled it. And what of the music itself? Strip away the nostalgia and romantic yearning, and you are left with an auditory wallpaper for thuggery. Imagine it, if you will, the strains of My Way accompanying the cracking of a blackjack across an unlucky gambler's temple, or the morbidly ironic backdrop of Fly Me to the Moon as some poor soul is unceremoniously dumped in the East River. When the so-called Rat Pack lounged and jested in Vegas, the hotels they frequented were fortresses of mob control, the very brick and mortar constructed atop an empire of violence and fear. Their glib camaraderie, their loose ties and tighter friendships were far from innocent. They were the smirking, swaggering embodiment of an entire system built on human misery. Now, some might protest, Sinatra was an artist, a talent, a cultural icon. But let us not confuse artistic excellence with moral worth. Whatever his gifts as a singer, and I do not deny the potency of his voice, even as I loathe the circumstances that amplified it, Sinatra's mob ties stain his legacy irreparably. Shall we excuse his complicity merely because he crooned a good tune? By that logic, should we rehabilitate Sacco and Vanzetti, even assuming their guilt? After all, whatever crimes they may have committed, and that is still disputed, at least they stood for something larger, something nobler than themselves. The same cannot be said of the Rat Pack, a true pack of rats, self-serving and shameless to the last. Sinatra's defenders often point to his later years, his philanthropy, his gestures toward civil rights. But a man who spends his prime years as an enabler of thugs does not cleanse himself by tossing a few crumbs of goodwill in his twilight. If anything, those gestures reek of self-serving redemption, a too little, too late attempt to varnish a sullied reputation. No, Sinatra's life, when examined in its entirety, is less an inspiring rags-to-riches story than a cautionary tale of moral compromise. He sang of love and loss, but his life story, had it been written without euphemism, would better be titled An Ode to Opportunism. There is a final layer of macabre irony in Sinatra's legacy. For all his paeans to love, to life, to human connection, the world he inhabited was one of fractured humanity. His mafia cohorts, those grim architects of chaos and death, were the antithesis of the world his music purported to celebrate. Yet he thrived in their company, danced their dances, sang their praises, and reaped their rewards. To listen to Sinatra with any awareness of his associations is to hear not just the melody, but the muffled sobs and muted cries of those crushed beneath the weight of organized crime. It turns the music into a grotesque, hollow echo. For contemporary Italians, or indeed anyone of Italian heritage, Sinatra's music ought to provoke not nostalgia but a shudder of revulsion. His songs, ostensibly a celebration of life, love, and sophistication, are forever tainted by their association with the very forces that have historically sullied the Italian name, forces of organized violence, exploitation, and fear. Instead of pride, his crooning should remind us of the real cultural legacy of countless Italian immigrants who toiled honestly, who suffered prejudice yet rose above it with dignity, and who refused the lure of criminal enterprise. To celebrate Sinatra is to risk celebrating the very stereotypes and associations that have long been used to demean and degrade Italian identity. His songs, inseparable from their morbid undercurrents, ought to serve as a cautionary anthem, a grim reminder of the moral compromises that arise when talent is harnessed in the service of power, corruption, and bloodshed.